Welcome to My Business Matters, the Michigan Chamber podcast.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jim Holcomb, President and CEO of the Michigan Chamber and today's podcast host. Today we're back for the second and final part of a two-part series on Michigan's tax policy. We're honored again today to have a real expert in the subject matter, Andrey Yushkov. He's a Senior Policy Analyst with the Tax Foundation. And in the first part, we looked kind of at the big picture, what makes Michigan tax competitive and the rankings across all states and how we stack up nationally. Today, we're going to shift from that broad view to something a little more focused. We're going to be taking a look at specifically two proposals that could dramatically reshape our tax landscape and have real consequences for how we stack up against other states in our economic climate. Andrey, from your national perspective, and you have decades of research, what should policymakers and the public be watching for as we look for tax changes that are going to be debated? We're going to go into a couple specifics, but what's the general framework that you look at or that we should look at as we evaluate tax policy? What are those broad perspectives?
Yeah, so in our work, we have several principles of sound tax policy, and those principles are simplicity, transparency, stability, and neutrality. Right? They all are extremely important, and I would say from the simplicity perspective, for instance, well, if you transition from a flat tax system to a progressive tax system, well, that unfortunately undermines simplicity because now you have different marginal tax rates for different groups of taxpayers. The tax may be slightly more complex to understand for taxpayers and more complicated to administer. Mm-hmm. So we generally favor, again, flat tax systems, specifically in individual and corporate income tax space. And progressive taxes, well, they tend to be more complex, less transparent, and also less neutral. So they tend to affect business decisions sometimes because when people out-migrate because of taxes, this is a business decision, right? This is a decision where to locate your business. This is the decision where to locate your employees or whether to allow them to relocate or not. So when those decisions are affected by the tax code, well, it violates the principle of neutrality. And the principle of stability is clear. We discussed it in the previous episode. Mm-hmm. So your tax system generally needs to be stable to be attractive to new and old taxpayers.
I think stability is one of the hardest ones for policymakers to achieve because they're consistently being impacted by the political environment. And if you have a change in power from maybe a more conservative legislator or governor to a more progressive or liberal, they have their own ideas of what they want state government to fund and how to get those resources. So it's that pendulum just constantly swinging back and forth that really destabilizes and has that negative impact you're talking about.
Yes, exactly. And that is very interesting because politically, what we observe, and again, we are not political analysts, but generally, blue states, states like California, New York, New Jersey, so traditionally blue states, they tend to implement more and more progressive tax policies. And red states, in contrast, they try to attract taxpayers by cutting tax rates and even by proposing something that we discussed in the last episode, like eliminating property taxes. We don't think it's a good idea generally, but we see those separating equilibria. That's what economists call it, right? Mm-hmm. So some states continue implementing more and more progressive tax policies while others continue cutting their tax rates. And Michigan is a unique situation. It's one of the few states that are sort of purple states. Mm-hmm. And those swings, right, from one political party to another, well, they can be detrimental to tax stability for sure, because one political party favors certain types of policies, another party favors, other types of tax policy. And from the perspective of stability, you are absolutely right. It can be, it can hurt tax competitiveness for sure.
And one of the proposals I'd like to get your thoughts on here in Michigan, and I think really impact stability. There's a House bill in Michigan for our listeners, House Bill 4144, and it would raise Michigan's corporate income tax from 6%, the current 6%, to 8.5%. From a competitive standpoint, what do you think a change like that would mean for Michigan, and where would that put us maybe with neighboring states and that particular rank?
Yeah, so this is a very dramatic change. Again, the rate is proposed to be increased from 6 to 8.5%, so 2.5 percentage points increase. And just to give you a perspective, right? So states like North Carolina, for instance, their entire corporate tax rate is 2.5%. And what is being proposed in Michigan is an increase of 2.5 percentage points. So it's a pretty dramatic increase, and especially considering that Michigan is one of the few states that allow local income taxes on corporate income. As you know, and as your listeners know, cities like Detroit, well, they have a relatively high corporate income tax burden as well. So if you combine this new 8.5% with the rate in Detroit, with a 2% rate in Detroit, you will see that the corporate income tax for the businesses located in Detroit will be 10.5%. So it will be actually the second highest in the nation, behind only New Jersey.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, because I think a lot of listeners probably don't understand that or think about it. There's a stacking of tax systems that, between jurisdictions, whether you're state or local or federal, and you have to look at the complete picture when a business is evaluating how to invest their resources or where to even locate. And unfortunately, when, maybe at the state level, they're debating this bill going from, a huge increase from 6 to 8.5, enough doesn't come out about the real impact, because it is a stackable tax.
Yeah, absolutely. And one other thing, very important thing from the perspective of revenue adequacy, that's another important principle of tax policy that academics like to discuss. So from the perspective of tax revenue adequacy, corporate income taxes have traditionally been a relatively unimportant source of revenue for state governments. Right, so the most important revenue sources for Michigan and for many other states are individual income tax and the sales and use tax. So in total, I believe we use data from the last fiscal year, but in total they constitute more than 75% of tax revenue in Michigan, and the corporate income tax is just 6%. So even if you increase it dramatically, well, it will hurt tax competitiveness, because it will affect incentives that businesses face. But at the same time, it will not bring sufficient revenues, especially if you want to earmark them for road construction or any other set of projects. So that's very important to understand, that if you need revenues to implement a certain project, and I believe roads are a very important subject of, road financing it's very important for the state of Michigan, but there are much better sources of revenue. Some of them, my colleagues at the Tax Foundation, they have written about vehicle miles travel taxes, so VMT taxes. They can be a decent alternative to gas tax revenue, because that is a problem everywhere, that people start using electric cars or hybrid cars, and their efficiency is much higher than before, and gas tax revenues go down, and you need to substitute them somehow. So there are ways to find an alternative dedicated source of revenue. For instance, the VMT tax. And I know that Michigan at some point explored the idea, but it didn't go anywhere. From our perspective, increasing the corporate income tax specifically to earmark those revenues for road construction is a very bad idea, because, again, it will hurt tax competitiveness, and it may not even generate enough revenues, especially because the corporate income tax is very volatile. So it's not the most stable source of revenue. It is volatile, and as a result, in times of crisis, well, you will face, a double pressure, because you will still need to construct or to renovate your roads, and your corporate income tax revenues will be down, because they are always down when recessions come. As a result, you will need to explore alternatives to this higher corporate income tax. So maybe it makes sense to start from something different, to start with another policy idea, to explore other potential sources of revenue instead of increasing the corporate income tax.
Yeah, I think it's important for listeners to understand too that I believe in Michigan, probably close to 9 out of 10 companies that are paying the corporate income tax currently are not what you consider big, large corporations. They're actually small and medium-sized employers. And how do you think by raising the corporate income tax, it's not only going to affect them, but maybe the broader economic ecosystem?
I think it will definitely affect all businesses that, C Corps and all businesses that pay corporate income taxes, because we saw several examples of large or very large businesses that recently relocated their headquarters. So everybody heard about Tesla or SpaceX, right? They moved from California to Texas. And there are examples like that with smaller firms, obviously. So you are right, because in the first part of the podcast, you raised this issue of, relocations and of different types of businesses and, the digital economy that we all now live in. So considering that the economy is digital, many types of those smaller businesses, well, they are much more mobile than they were before. And for them, of course, an extra 2.5% is maybe a decision point. So we don't want to pay that, and we are just relocating to either neighboring states, like Ohio, that doesn't have a corporate income tax. Ohio, unfortunately, it has a gross receipts tax, so it's another harmful tax structure. Or maybe to Indiana, or to those states that don't tax corporate income at all. So, of course, from the competitiveness perspective, this will be detrimental both for large businesses potentially and for smaller firms.
Yeah, and I think from our perspective, when I talk to our members at the Michigan Chamber of Commerce, what I hear is making Michigan less competitive in a tax climate is absolutely going to have detrimental impacts beyond just the individual employer like we've discussed. It impacts population growth. It impacts maybe that entrepreneur who never starts a business, somebody who doesn't grow a business, and really it's counterproductive to the overall goals of what we're trying to accomplish here in Michigan. But if I look at your four, you kind of referenced 4 attributes earlier on: simplicity, transparency, neutrality, stability. If we look at that, is there a common tax base that you see in states that are higher in rankings or states that are more competitive? Is there some type of tax where you say, you know what, if you're going to tax people, and we need to get, everyone has to pay some tax. We have to fund our government in an efficient and effective level, but we got to make sure it's not a burdensome tax. Is there something that states should look at and say, this is a better way to do it?
Yeah, so I mentioned that 2 most important sources of revenue for nearly all the states are the individual income tax and the sales tax. And we believe that with the sales tax particularly, there are certain reforms that can bring additional revenues, and that can still be simple, neutral, and they definitely won't disincentivize investment and growth. So Michigan, for instance, has a very narrow sales tax base. So as you and your listeners know, some services are exempt and even some goods are exempt in Michigan. And the sales tax rate is relatively low compared to both its neighbors and its competitors. So the 6% rate, and also Michigan doesn't have a local option sales tax, unlike some other states like Tennessee or Illinois, for instance. So this rate is relatively low, and the base is relatively narrow. So there is definitely a potential to expand the sales tax base to include some new services, some digital services. But it's very important here not to overreach, not to include business inputs, intermediate goods and services. But even in the final consumption space, it's very possible for Michigan, and that would be an example of an excellent tax reform, to expand the sales tax base to certain final consumption services. that will bring additional revenue, and that will not really affect tax competitiveness. You can even, increase the sales tax rate from 6 to 6.5%, and it will be, I think it will bring even more revenues than this corporate income tax increase that we have discussed. So again, there are different ways, even if you need revenues, you are absolutely right. States need revenues in order to function, in order to provide public goods and services, but there are good ways and relatively, bad ways to raise revenue. Yeah. And we believe that Michigan has a great potential here because without increasing the corporate income tax, without increasing the individual income tax, you can raise quite some revenues if you need that for road construction, for road renovation, or for any other services potentially.
Yeah, I think it's an important perspective to look at, too, because another ballot proposal that's going on here in Michigan I'd like to get your take on is there's been introduced a ballot proposal to institute a graduated income tax in Michigan, and currently that's prohibited in our state constitution. Proponents are trying to add a 5% surcharge on what they consider high earners, whether that's individual filing of $500,000 or more, or $500,000 or more, or joint tax returns of $1 million or more. And kind of wondering what you think the trade-offs are with a policy like that. And I think, one distinction we make is it may sound good politically. They make it seem like they're just going after wealthy people. But there's a lot of pass-through entities, a lot of small businesses who will get harmed, who are Subchapter S or partnerships, LLCs, who pay their tax at the individual income tax level.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So this potential policy, a 5% surcharge on high earners, so that's not a good policy because, again, it's not simple. It moves from a simple tax code, a flat tax rate, to a progressive tax rate, essentially. You can call it a surtax, but it's still, the same base. So essentially, it's just creating another bracket, a bracket for high earners. And that's what we consider when we, rank different states on our index. Even if they call it a surtax or, a millionaire's tax or whatever they may call it, it's still, in essence, it's just adding an extra bracket on your individual income tax. And you are totally right that pass-through entities, they pay those individual taxes, right? Pay taxes at the individual level. And so they all will be subject to this additional surtax or surcharge or another bracket. And I think what is important for Michigan, before even considering this reform, you need to understand what other states that implemented those surtaxes are experiencing currently. You can look at the examples of, again, Massachusetts. I mentioned it in the first part of the podcast, or New York, California. So they have taxes for millionaires. They have very high rates for top earners. And what they have experienced in recent years was the out-migration, and particularly the out-migration of top earners. The problem with that, of course, theoretically, if you live in a vacuum and you want to improve equity, of course you can try to tax high earners. That may be a noble goal for some legislators or for some policy groups. But the problem here is that the environment is very competitive, and it's, again, very easy for high earners, particularly, to relocate from Michigan or from those states that consider surtaxes for millionaires, to relocate from those states to, again, Florida, Texas, Indiana, because Indiana now has a much lower individual income tax rate, than to stay in Michigan and pay those high taxes. Because in order to pay those high taxes, of course, high earners need to see that some services have dramatically improved. But it's typically not the case. You cannot see it in 1 year or 2 years. If you collect more revenues, you don't typically see that some services improve dramatically as a result. And so there is a mismatch between higher revenues and higher tax payments and services that still are not ideal compared to other states. So I really want to encourage legislators and business leaders to think, to compare, to use our analysis to compare Michigan with those high-tax states and see what they are experiencing currently before, implementing this reform.
Yeah, I think it's always good. Look at, it's nice to have examples to look at and say, okay, what was the impact? It's not a guessing game. You can look at it. It's real data, and that should be helpful in forming opinions here in Michigan. For our listeners to remember, we have a 4.25% income tax in Michigan. 5% would over double it to 9.25%. Andrey, what would that do? You mentioned Indiana. I think they're at 3%. I think Ohio would be lower. What would that do to Michigan's standing in your competitiveness rankings if this was implemented in Michigan?
So Michigan would definitely move closer to the middle of the index. So now again they're number 14. But these reforms considered separately, they would move Michigan to, closer to number 25. So you can see that immediately there will be an impact on tax competitiveness. And particularly if you compare Michigan with its neighbors, this impact will be really dramatic. And, one thing about Midwestern states and states in the Iron Belt is that most of them, in addition to state-level taxes, income taxes, they also have local income taxes. And when you consider, say, this surtax, 5% surtax, yes, you are right. It's 4.25 plus 5, it's 9.25. But for cities like Detroit, there is an extra 2.4% tax for residents, right? So Michigan will really be closer, if you consider local income taxes, it will be closer to states like California, to states like New Jersey, and even higher than states like Massachusetts. So you need to really comprehensively look at this reform. And, states like Ohio and Indiana, they also have local income taxes. And in some counties or in some localities, those taxes are relatively high. But still, if you add this 5% surcharge, Michigan will be way higher than all its neighbors. Yep. So,
and exactly what we don't need here in Michigan. We need to be more competitive. We need to be trying to become economically more viable for businesses to locate here and to grow here and to raise your family and be pro-taxpayer, not anti-taxpayer. We need to fund our government, as you and I have discussed, but it needs to be done. You laid out, I thought, were four really good qualities: simplicity, transparency, neutrality, and stability. And growing the income tax with a graduated income tax just seems to violate many of those principles.
Yes.
Yeah. Speaking with Andrey Yushkov, he's the Senior Policy Analyst at the Tax Foundation. We've had, a really great conversation on Michigan's tax climate, a couple of damaging ballot proposals. Andrey, as we wrap up here, the second of our two-part series, just wondering if you had any final thoughts on your biggest caution or recommendation for Michigan as we navigate not only these proposals, but going forward, trying to make sure that Michigan is attractive and high-ranking.
So again, ranking higher on our index doesn't mean necessarily no taxes, right? Mm-hmm. It still means that you have a choice. You always have a choice. If you need to raise more revenues as a state government, you always have a choice whether to increase corporate taxes or implement a millionaire's tax or, say, expand the sales tax base and slightly increase the sales tax rate. So those reforms may bring equivalent extra revenues, but they will have a differential impact on businesses and individuals alike. So I really encourage legislators, policymakers in Michigan to consider tax reform comprehensively. So to look at various options that other states have done recently, to look at those examples where states started losing their tax base, essentially started losing their taxpayers, and actually to avoid those policies that may disincentivize people to relocate to Michigan. There are options around. So there are always options that are much less dramatic, much less harmful for economic growth and for tax competitiveness. So if you or your listeners need any advice on how to implement a responsible tax reform, I encourage you to connect with our state team, and we will be happy to answer your question, to help you consider different options and to navigate this complicated landscape of state tax policy.
Andrey, our listeners have really benefited, and I've benefited from these conversations, this two-part series with you. Again, it's Andrey Yushkov with this Senior Policy Advisor with the Tax Foundation. Where can listeners go to get more information and learn more about the Tax Foundation? Because not just for policymakers or elected leaders, you really have just great tools for the average citizen and for taxpayers to evaluate what's beneficial to them and what they should be advocating for when they talk to their legislators.
Yes, you all can go to our website, taxfoundation.org, and you will be able to find our recent analysis with respect to federal tax changes, tariffs, but also plenty of materials on state tax policy. So every year we publish our annual update on individual income tax rates, corporate income tax rates, sales tax rates. We also have a number of publications on property taxes and responsible property tax reform, and I really encourage our listeners to go and explore. And we have, of course, topical blog posts. Say if there is a proposal somewhere, we typically address that proposal, and it may be relevant for our listeners in Michigan specifically.
Again, a very big thank you to Andrey Yushkov and the Tax Foundation for helping us to get a closer look at the sweeping tax proposals here in Michigan and the importance of smart, sound, and stable tax policy in moving Michigan forward. And thank you to all of you for listening. Please get involved, make your voices heard, subscribe or like our podcast for easy notification. And as always, you can visit michamber.com for more information on tax policy or any issues impacting Michigan and learning how you can engage and make sure your voice is heard.